Hey everybody, this is Minion Soldier, and it is very, very early in the morning. Sorry, some scheduling issues, which means that I'm up now before the dawn, recording this episode of Ship Updates. Now, luckily, or unfortunately, there were really no ship updates, this week. So I figured I would make an episode kind of talking about ships in general. And, this is the ship cockpit. We've seen it many, many times before. And CIG is always kind of endeavoring to make the cockpit much more interactive for players. But that also comes with a bit of a problem, right? Because we have all kinds of dials and switches and stuff that we can interact with. But we don't really interact with them, right? And CIG wants to make it so that the dials and switches, they flip, when they're pressed. And they want to make the cockpit much more interactive. And I think that ideally, yes, I do want the pilot to have interactions with the cockpit. I think that makes for a much more immersive experience. And I think that most players would agree with that. But what I don't want to do is what we currently have, which is zooming in on different panels and stuff and going, waiting for the wonderful, inner thought system, which is terrible, by the way, and, zooming in on these areas and flipping these switches, because in a dogfight, that's useless. What I think CIG should go for, and, maybe it's a lot more work than I anticipate it's going to be, but I think that what CIG should go for is rather to have the pilot themselves I guess it would be kind of a procedural animation, interact with the cockpit, responding to player inputs. If you get into a ship like the Gladius right now and you hop into that cockpit, your character is going to reach out and flip a few switches when you hit the R key to start up your ship. And everything kind of heats up and warms up, and that's the whole startup sequence that CIG wants to have in that fighter and obviously in other fighters, especially for Squadron 42. It's also kind of a reason why I kind of hold on to the Gladius on my alt account, is just because the Gladius is always getting the gold standard treatment, right? So it's cool to see where CIG is going with things. It's a good kind of touchstone to have, or a good mile marker to be able to kind of come back to and check things out. But what I think should happen is, when you press a keybind, or when you press a button on your joystick, your HOTAS, your gamepad, your keyboard, whatever, that the player character in the game should automatically reach out and flip that switch, or flip it back, or they should make that adjustment on that dial or whatever. And you should see that as you're kind of interacting with the game, but your character shouldn't be kind of like, looking out and looking into a certain section of the cockpit and zooming in and flipping that switch and all that, because that's simply too much. And I mean, to be perfectly honest, some people might disagree with this, but if you think about it, most of you probably own a car or have driven a car in the past. Maybe you have a work truck, something like that, whatever. When you're used to driving a vehicle, you don't look for buttons and switches. You just flip them. You don't look for your signal indicator when you're turning. You don't, when you're shifting gears in your car, you don't look down at the little pattern on the gear shift lever to tell you where to put the gear. You just shift gears. I realize that saying that manual transmissions are so rare in cars these days, but I still have one. But you understand what I'm saying is, you interact with the different controls in your car, the door locks, the windows, everything, the headlights, the window wipers, the heaters, all that stuff. You interact with that without looking at it. You just do it. You go like, oh, I want to turn the radio on, I want to turn the radio off. And even as I'm saying this, you're probably making some of these motions with your hand. You're like, oh yeah, I never thought of that. I never look at any of the controls. It's funny how they're all labeled, but realistically, after about a month of owning the car, you don't even need, the labels, you don't even need them. You know where everything is and you just hit it. And I think that flying ships from the cockpit should be the same thing, that we shouldn't have to look at these various controls to interact with them, especially in a situation like you're seeing here with, Star Runner. There are certain controls that are out of my point of view, right? That I just can't see, that I would have to turn my camera around to look at, hit the F key or the Z key to kind of move around and, interact with these controls. And the truth of it is that who does that really serve? I mean, the ability to look around within the cockpit is one thing, and it's good, but the necessity to do that, to interact with various controls, it really serves no purpose. I think that by making it a procedural animation, I'm just putting air quotes around that because I'm not even sure that that's what you would really call it, where you basically would anchor like either a switch or a flip or animation to certain locations, and your arm would simply reach out and do that. By doing that, you would allow players to still have that kind of connectedness to the cockpit without forcing them to, on a granular level, interact with those various control panels. I think that would be the better method. And I mean, certainly, if you think about it from an observer's point of view, like, let's say I was here flying my Mercury Star Runner and you were standing in the cockpit right next to me, and you saw me reaching out and flipping all these switches and doing all the stuff, and not just manipulating the flight yoke, or the flight stick, depending on what I'm flying, but, actually going out and flipping these switches, and you would see my character doing that, and I could do that freely without having to change my point of view or anything like that. I think that would overall be a far better system than the one that we currently have, and potentially the one that CIG is proposing, where we still go in and flip the buttons, but they all flip. I totally agree with what Chris Roberts is trying to do in order to make it look like we're actually flipping our switches, because it is an important part of the experience. I mean, you think about, say, Star Wars, when Han Solo is about to hit hyperspace. When he's about to go to hyperspace, because he reaches up and he grabs the 3 controls and he kind of pulls them back, or maybe it's 4. I'm sorry for all the the exacting detail oriented people out there, but what I'm talking about, and you can see it in your mind's eye right now. Like on the old Enterprise, when they're going to warp, in the early movies, and I think in the newer movies as well, Sulu reaches out and he grabs that hand control and pushes it up. And I feel that that's an important and immersive element. But the idea of actually having to, once again, zoom in and interact with these controls in a combat situation or even in a normal flight situation is very unappealing. I think that it doesn't really add anything to the experience, and in fact detracts from it. And I know that there are people out there who want to, zoom in and, flip all these, dials and stuff. But I think that even they are going to realize that interacting with a cockpit on that level, especially when you look at all the controls that are in there and all the controls that you would have to manipulate, would very quickly become a tedious inconvenience for the player. So I think that, by kind of anchoring animations to certain parts of the control panel and making them respond or activate whenever a player activates certain controls, would be a far better solution than to have, players having to actually go in and flip all those dials and switches themselves. That is, my point of view on the thing. And that's that would be something that I would like to see, as CIG is now kind of bringing certain ships. I think the F-7A, the Gladius, the Retaliator, and I think there is one other. They're all obviously Squadron 42 ships, but they're all being brought up to CIG's gold standard. I think that these would be the ideal candidates for a system like this. And since to a certain degree, the Gladius has that already with its startup sequence. I would just like to see that expanded to all these interactions. I think that, that would be a good middle ground, especially in terms of immersion, but also in terms of playability. So that would be an update that I would like to deliver on ships in general. But I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thanks for watching.
Thank you for watching. So if you want to keep up with the latest and greatest in Star Citizen and Squadron 42's development, please follow us on our social media channels. See you soon.